Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's webinar series. So, we're here with Sean Upton McLaughin. Sean has a wealth of experience, being in the China mainland for plus 15 years now, Sean. Sorry, correct me if I'm wrong.
It's about more like 14 years, but close enough.
Okay. Started his career at Huawei in PR and has become a master of various communication channels. So, really graduated up the hierarchy in the corporate career and now is responsible for overseeing teams. I met Sean when he worked at Huawei and then when he worked for Weber Shandwick in PR communications, particularly supporting some of the biggest brands in China, selling their products overseas and helping them really define what their corporate communications and public relations strategies should be. So Sean has since held interim CMO and director of marketing positions. He's now the CEO of Sage Site Consulting and works with a multitude of Chinese and Western brands, helping them adapt their strategies and their overseas internationalization approaches for Chinese brands and helping Western brands better understand the Chinese market. Today, he is here to talk about West meets East, communication hacks for cross-cultural challenges. So we're looking at really resolving some of those challenges that might crop up from the culture and how they can be best managed to define the best outcome. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'd like everybody to welcome Sean. So Sean, please take it away and share your screen whenever you're ready.
All right, thanks a lot, Jake. Glad to be here. So that should be it, I believe. Can you see that okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. So let's just jump into it. Hi, everybody. I'm Sean. As Jake mentioned, I have spent almost 15 years working in China. And personally, what I'd say is one of the most interesting things about my own career, both for me personally as well as for the topic of cross-cultural communications, is that unlike many, I have spent almost the complete majority of my own professional career in a culture that was not my own. So out of what, 14, 15 years of experience, there's only been maybe 1 or 2 years that has been from a non-Chinese or Asian company that includes Hong Kong. So today we'll be talking about several things. I first want to just quickly introduce myself, but then we'll be moving into defining what we mean by cross-cultural communications, or comms, as we say in marketing speak. We'll be talking about some of the basic challenges, both from an academic standpoint as well as from what I've experienced myself. We'll be talking about what I feel is the best way to, both from organizational point of view and a personal point of view, to move towards resolving some of those challenges that come up working, say, across culture, whether you're marketing to consumers or whether you're trying to develop your own career within an organization that is, again, from a different culture. And then, as we mentioned in the Angles WeChat group, we'll be talking about 3 different case studies, which I will not be naming the specific companies just for being safe, but at the same time they did actually happen, and I was part of the teams that dealt with these specific cases. So just to rehash them again, the first one was, if you're trying to translate speeches and articles from a prominent Chinese CEO into English, what is the correct balance between adhering to the cultural nuance on the Chinese side versus speaking to the English audience? The second case study was, I believe, if you are trying to create a video advert targeting an English-speaking audience, who is the right person to decide what the right communications medium and messaging is, and how do you resolve that effectively? And the third case study will be, if you are a Western company moving into the Chinese market, what is the right way? What is the balance between doing it your way versus the Chinese way? So if you have any thoughts on those, feel free to enter those into the chat. If you have any other questions, you can please enter them anytime, and we will talk about those more in more detail at the end of the presentation. But for now, let's jump into it.
Just one thing,
So,
Sean, can you put it in
yeah.
presentation mode because your screen's
Oh, was it
got quite
not? Oh,
a high resolution. It's
there we go. There we go. Is that better?
perfect. Please continue.
Okay. So just without wanting to talk too much about my company, SageSci is more or less the culmination of my own experience in China, first working in public relations in Huawei, but then really expanding my role to be responsible not just for global projects, but also for global PR, global marketing at various organizations. And so what we're looking to do is we're looking to provide a better agency solution to Chinese organizations going overseas, not only providing on-site expertise in-house as to really lessen that cross-cultural communications gap, which exists and can get very serious in many cases, but we're also looking to help Chinese companies that are very successful from a sales standpoint take the next step towards managing their reputation successfully in Western markets, and also to become more well-known with consumers and to actually be able to take on the Western brands in their home markets. And we provide 4 different services, brand acceleration, brand communication, brand transformations, as well as brand protection work. But specifically about myself, I worked internally at a number of organizations, Huawei, Vivo. I cooperated with several companies such as HashKey, Oppo from the agency side, and then I've also worked in high-level positions in new energy as well as the gaming market. And I think one of the most interesting things that one will find out if you're working inside a different culture long term is you do have to deal with many things such as dealing with professional development from a different culture's point of view, having to deal with corporate politics from a different culture's point of view, and in many cases having to kind of look at, is it an issue of being right, or is it an issue of how do we make the other side feel comfortable? And that's part of what we'll be talking about today in the presentation. And so one of the things to be aware of when we're looking at cultural communications is there is not necessarily a right answer. Like if we're saying, how do you design an effective marketing team or a marketing campaign? It may be there's a simple number of steps, or how do you effectively use AI? But there's so much nuance when it comes to cross-cultural communication. So what we're going to be looking at today is focusing more on the mindset, cultivating a mindset that is more open and that can also think about, this is what makes sense to me, or this is what is right to me, but what is right to another culture as well. It's not always so simple. But if there are any questions on these, I'll have some links I can share in the Angles group after the presentation. But let's jump into it. One of the reason I'd like to start off with these Hofstede's cultural dimensions, even though I never use these day to day in any of my work, but this is one of the first things that I was taught when I was doing my international management MBA back more than 10 years ago. And the reason that we study these, and I recommend that anybody interested in cross-cultural communication study them, is that the way the human mind works, in my opinion, or at least from a Western point of view, is we're very much wedded to the idea that this is the way I do things, or this is the way we do things, and this is the right way. And that's one of the key difficulties, the key challenges we have to deal with when we want to, say, effectively communicate across cultures. So there's a few examples here. I won't talk too much about them, but oftentimes if we talk about low context versus high context, or a high versus low power distance, these are things that between Asians and Western cultures, you might see these as being important things. You might also look at things like industry versus indulgent, masculinity versus femininity. Asian cultures can be very much more masculine. You might see Northern European cultures like, I think Norway might be more of a feminine culture. And so you don't have to worry about this too much, but one of the things I think is very useful is that there are a number of web resources that you can look at. You can actually look at different cultures side by side and maybe understand how they might be different. So for example, obviously, if you're just moving to, let's say you're coming from the US or Europe to China, it might be very simple. This is the way Chinese people act. This is the way Western people act in your home country or in a broader region like Europe. But let's say you're managing a global project and you're 5 different countries act as team members, it might suddenly become much more complicated. And so there needs to be at least a base level of awareness in terms of how do you at least not piss anybody off, I think is the clearest way to put it. So I would definitely suggest everyone take a look at these. If you're interested in maybe improving your career development in China or the USA, if you're not from there, this definitely might be a good idea to kind of take a look at this. It's certainly useful to keep in the back of your minds. But when we look into what we actually experience when we're, say, at work, in my experience, there are 4 levels. There is the personal level, and that might be between you and your colleagues, between you and your boss. And you'd be surprised how many issues come up if you're just talking to colleagues. And maybe you say something that really annoys them, and this might be exacerbated, as you go from month to month. If you're doing something that your boss doesn't like, and they're from a culture that does not like to directly give their feedback, then you might be developing a worse and worse relationship, which could again affect your career development prospects. Organizational level, this leads to things like corporate politics, such as can be more common in Chinese organizations and Western organizations. It is much more common to have silos take place. And so if you're looking to do a global project, like I've done many times for companies like Huawei, Vivo, etc., it's one thing you'll find is that different teams do not necessarily work well together. And if you want to make sure that big bosses are happy with you, you have to make sure it works. And that means you have to delve into the swamp, we'll call it, of corporate politics and try and make multiple stakeholders happy, which maybe don't like each other, don't want to work together, but you still need to find ways to make it happen. And that means finding ways that you can effectively communicate, because you're not anybody's boss. You have to, from the position of not having anyone report to you, you have to convince people that they can trust you and that you're willing to work with them. You're not going to use the Chinese expression, take away their face or to make them embarrassed, and you're not going to do anything that will make them look bad in front of their bosses. And so all of these things kind of come together in a perfect storm, which is not fun, but if you have prepared, then you can certainly come out unscathed and get more opportunities. Client level, this could be anything that is more on the marketing side, where maybe it could be B2B, you're trying to work with clients from a different culture, whether it be China to the USA, Europe to China. It could also be on the consumer level, which is something I mentioned earlier. I work with Chinese companies and how they can more effectively tell their stories to sell their products to consumers in the USA, in Europe, in North America. And there are many cultural issues that come up, which we'll talk about later, that prevent that from being so easy. Country level, that's much more directly related to the cultural dimensions we talked about earlier. It's not something we'll talk about too much today. Being on the business side, I don't generally have to talk with governments too much, but it certainly might be relevant to some of you. And then, of course, the ways we communicate after we've gone through looking at what type of culture our organization has, what levels we need to communicate at. We also have to think about through what mediums we're communicating, whether we're writing articles and blogs, whether we are trying to have effective emails to different team members or bosses, or whether we're actually talking at a conference to people inside and outside our company. There might be actions we take, such as what actions a company takes in the market, whether they might have nonverbal communications, what personal action you take and how they're perceived by different stakeholders. And then, of course, if you're creating marketing and branding material, the ways we, as I found out last year, the pictures and video content we create, say, for the Chinese market is very different than what you might create for the Western market. And so it's not simply about communicating effectively via words, via action. It's about how do you sell effectively. It's also about communicating in, say, via different mediums. And so I would say don't worry too much about this. It is important, however, so everybody can look at how complex it can potentially be when we're doing cross-cultural communications. But at the very least, you need to keep all these in the back of your mind. You need to understand that all of these can come together. Sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's harder, but it's all about expanding your mindset and being aware that these are all issues that can come to the forefront that I have experienced, and I think others have too. But as we finish our introduction to what corporate communications is from my perspective, I think it's important as we move forward with the presentation there are clear things that I believe cross-cultural communications, or CCC, can help you with, but it's also important to have a realistic perspective. So for example, if your manager just doesn't like you, cross-cultural communications is not going to help with that, but it can help you communicate more effectively and build a better relationship if there's nothing standing in the way of that. You can help you communicate more effectively in an organization, but if you simply are part of a toxic organization, it can't fix that. We're looking to convince and communicate more effectively to customers, but if we screw up, if we sell them faulty products, then CCC is not going to fix that directly, at least. And again, we're looking to not directly initially, maybe you say it's not like ChatGPT-4 where maybe suddenly you can do a lot more. You actually have to put in a lot of studying time. It's almost like learning a new language to a certain degree. But again, this is something that we're looking at, if you're looking to grow professionally, if you're looking to maybe move to a new culture, China or the USA, and be in it for the long haul, cross-cultural communications is definitely something that will be important to begin sooner rather than later. So one of the biggest barriers, and these may seem simple, but changing our own mindsets, changing our own approaches that, say if you're 20 years old, you have so many embedded approaches, but if you're 30 or 40 years old, then there's so much unlearning that you may have to do if this applies to you. But the most common issue is we naturally, instinctually will think that what makes sense to me is the right way of doing things. Doesn't matter if you're from China, if you're from the United States, if you're from Europe. This is one of the biggest challenges to overcome. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in our first case study when it comes to, how do we take what a Chinese leader says in a speech and have that be communicated effectively to a Western audience. And that is not very easy at all, simply because thinking that what makes sense to me is the right way very often does not make sense to who your intended audience is, whether it's a business partner, whether it's a consumer, whether it's a colleague. And so therefore, it's always good if you can say, whether you're talking to a manager, whether you are talking to a business partner, if you can share more about your culture, if you can share about what makes sense to you, it's always great if people can meet in the middle, but more often than not, that simply just does not happen. And therefore, if we want to increase our chances of success, it's always best if we are the one that puts the other party first, because then at least we can control what we do and we can move more towards a place where we can communicate in a language that they're able to accept and understand. So that's the first point. Not understanding customer communication needs. When we say customer, that could be a consumer, it could be a business client, it could be your boss, because if they're your customer, you're trying to meet their needs when you communicate more effectively to them. And so that gap of knowledge is something that we can fix by studying. You can study what different countries, what cultures they have, such as we talked about with the Hofstede's cultural dimensions. You can pay more attention when, say, your boss is talking to understand how they speak, what they expect, but either finding people that can help you with the right expertise or putting in the time to learn yourself. These are all things that we can do and that you need to do if you want to be able to take the next steps, whether, again, you're developing your own career or if you're looking to, say, move and sell to a different country and a different culture. And lastly, one of the things that can really derail everything is that when you actually are in a huge organization, it's not simply you that says, okay, here's what we're going to do, here's how we're going to say it, and it's done. When I worked, especially in Huawei, there was an incredibly complex chain of processes, even if it was for a speech. For example, you might have the executive who wrote a speech, then you might have someone who is the approver of that speech, then it might go to the head translator, and then it might go to the junior translators, and then it might go to a writer or a PR expert like myself, and then after that, it might have to go through a second or third round of approvals, then it might go to the actual media outreach team, in which case it might go through a few more rounds of revisions. And the reason we mention this is that if you don't have a clear process that remains consistent on how we want to communicate, whether it be as a company, as a department, as an executive, then you will have a huge number of people who maybe with the best of intentions will all be making decisions on what they think is the right way. And I've seen this time and time again, that communications will be changed, communications will be made worse simply because there is no universally agreed upon, how is it that we communicate? Even if you aren't speaking completely in your target customer's language, it's better to be 50% of the way there and be consistent, be 70% of the way there. Otherwise, nobody will be able to understand you. And this is in my past 13, 14 years, these are the biggest challenges I think that I've seen. And you may see that I am leaning a little bit more towards the organizational point of view because it's much easier to control you speaking one-on-one to your colleagues, you speaking one-on-one to your bosses. But when you're talking about things such as organizational, internal communications, marketing campaigns and activities, there's so many more moving parts. And having a clear communications approach that you can then sell to other members of the organization and have alignment on that, that becomes much more important. If, again, you're able to pull it off, it's not necessarily going to succeed every time, but it's certainly a worthwhile goal in my experience. So I generally would recommend that you take a 5-step process. You need to know who you're communicating to. You need to know what they want, who they are, and what they want. You need to understand what an approach might be, whether it's simply that you write down what you're going to say, how you're going to say it. You review with another colleague to see if they have any tips, and then you go for it. And then, of course, you need to follow through all the way through. How did I do? When I spoke to this executive this way, did they take my feedback to heart? Did they look happy or did they look not happy? How do we go and improve that? Here's a few examples. If you're looking to, again, I won't read through all of this. We can share this with everybody later. But if you want to design a more effective marketing campaign, you need to very clearly understand who the consumer is, how they buy, what language they prefer when they're buying products, if they're looking at advertisements. And you'd be surprised how many companies don't necessarily look into this when they're moving to a new market. You need to have a clear plan for a marketing strategy. You need to make sure that you have a clear strategy and make sure whatever communication strategy you've chosen is adhered to throughout the product team, which could be 20 people, it could be 30 people, 40 people. And then you need to, as the process goes through, you need to make sure you identify what communication tactics are working best with your target audience so that you can kind of have a repeating cycle where you continue to hone in on what is preferred in, say, this new country, which maybe there's nobody from that country on your team if you're a smaller company, but you need to have a process where you're constantly learning, constantly improving your communications, because if you're doing business in a new market, you will always be at a disadvantage compared to the local companies. And understanding that and understanding you always have to be striving to improve and to be better understood by your target client in this case. That's, if you're just simply going through the motions, if you're simply saying, if you're taking marketing and promotion as just a task orientation, you just keep doing the same tasks every single time. You don't know if you're doing something well, you don't know how it's being received, you don't know if there's any areas to improve. Again, this is common in many organizations when they're planning their marketing. But if you're looking to compete with local competitors, if you're looking to really reach and build trust with the end consumer and a new market and new culture, then this is something that can steer you in the right direction. So again, no, that's about 20 minutes, so nothing too complex. I think there's a lot of material that we can think about, but at this point, we're going to talk a little bit more about the case studies. I'm going to take a quick pause here, not just so I can take a drink of water, but I would invite anyone watching, if you have any questions on the case studies that I mentioned in the group, feel free to start listing out questions, and then Jake will be able to share them after we're all done. If you have any other challenges that you personally encountered when you were dealing with cross-cultural issues, we'd be very happy for you to share them. Because again, there's often not going to be a right answer. And I would discourage people from thinking about cross-cultural communications in that way, simply because if we're looking to communicate effectively across cultures, we have to often put what we think the right way is aside so we can try and find a compromise in the middle. So even if there is a right way, thinking about it that way can really put up a lot of mental barriers that can really be a detriment to long-term success. So anything to add, Jake, before we continue for the case studies?
No, I'm saving my questions to the end. I want to
All
see if
right.
we're going to answer them in these case studies.
Great. So let's talk about the first case study. And then again, this is for a Chinese telecommunications company. And this is when I was part of the PR team. And one of the interesting things about some Chinese organizations' business culture is that it's not simply an issue of Chinese to translator to English. There's actually a culture within a culture, as I found, because I'll actually share a link to this, but it's a little bit similar to some of those Xi Jinping books where he basically has a lot of his speeches. But if you take, if you take what they've written, they actually don't write it in Chinese that can be understood by regular Chinese people. It's almost an organizational language in and of itself, whereas they use whether, in some cases, it's kind of more military terminology, which is not, doesn't mean the company or organization is militaristic, but they simply use that maybe because one of the founders used to be in the military or through a different reason. But oftentimes, you had to have a very complex communications workflow where if you have a regular translator look at it, they won't know what the leader means in maybe about 30–40% of the content. And so you'll have to have a senior translator or an owner of the executive who will then write out what these actually mean. And of course, as the organization continues onwards, people will generally know what certain terminology means, but you then have to have a more complex and a longer process in order to get those closer to, say, a final English version. And one of the issues that was very interesting that we found is we very often had issues where we would be, say, trying to get the spirit of the communications, which means often meant we would consciously be choosing not to have 100% native English in how we wrote it. Maybe we would try and get it around 70–80%, but there would always have to be a compromise because while we were trying to help the organization, the executive communicate effectively with their Western audiences, we also were, from a personal or team or organizational point of view, having to have our own communications with the executive or the executive team in order to make sure that we had those relationships on at least an even footing. And so, but it was very common for maybe an executive or a senior translator, or even if we were doing, say, language or PR communications for a big event for a Chinese internal client to say, no, this is how you say it correctly in English, which from, say, just an English point of view without any other considerations would be wrong, but you had to be able to try and balance that. There were many different ideas about what the right way was to express something, especially if like, let's say, an aircraft carrier steaming towards the United States, which had nothing to do with war, but could be misunderstood on so many levels. So how do you actually move forward to understand what is actually supposed to be meant? And so, yeah, that's that case study. If anybody has any questions on that, let me know. So there isn't really a right answer, but what I will say is that we always tried to go for at least 70–80% native English, maybe with some longer explanations for certain terms. We obviously had to have certain red lines from a PR perspective in terms of you don't say anything about war, don't say anything about atomic bombs, even if it's meant very, very metaphorically, or, wolf culture was something that meant something very positive from a Chinese point of view, but sounded very negative. And so it can be a very big mess if you let it in. So you always have to try and meet in the middle to a certain degree. Because again, when it comes to cross-cultural communications, there's maybe the personal and personal development communications, there's the team and organizational communications, there's the client or consumer-focused communications. And if you're looking at telecoms from the Chinese side, there's also going to be governmental considerations as well. So it's very interesting, but there's no easy answer. Let's move on to the second case study. So this is another interesting one, this one from the smartphone industry. And this was something where I was working on it from the agency side. But we had a very interesting case where we were trying to do what would you call it, an advert for an anti-rumble function, or an anti-movement, or I should say an anti-shake function for a phone. And there was a big discussion between both the Chinese side, which was the internal client, and then the Western creative side for the agency. And it was really about, what is the right imagery that will effectively communicate this idea of not just anti-shake, but also in a high-end way. Because if you're trying to sell a high-end phone, you want it to be seen as high-end. You want it to be maybe touching the emotional chords. And that is another interesting thing when it comes to cross-cultural communications. If we look at it from the Chinese point of view and the Western point of view, there can be very different ideas about what is actually communicating something that is heart-touching. And so there was a big conversation that lasted probably a few weeks, I think, about who was the one to say this is the right way. And so one of the things that for the Chinese listeners that I'm sure you've heard, is if you're talking to any boss in China, and I might have said this a few times myself, it's very common to hear, 我的想法是, my way of thinking is this, which maybe it sounds very kind of roundabout, but it basically means this is what we're doing. And so, and again, if your boss says we're doing something, then that's basically what you're doing, but it also means that it's not necessarily going to be something. And so one of the things I found, and this is something I've had to do as well too, is that if we're looking at how do we change our own behavior, not our boss's behavior, because that's not necessarily going to be easy, is we have to be thinking about in what cases do we rely on our instinct and our ego, and in what cases do we have to take our ego out of it. So, for example, if I write a video script for some of my Chinese marketing material for my own business, and I think, oh, wow, this is a really good idiom or a really good phrase to use to get my point across. And then I maybe have my editor review it, and they say, oh, actually, this is not right. This doesn't sound good. At that point, I have a conflict because I have my experience in China, and I think this works really well. But then a native person is telling me it doesn't work well. And so that's, again, one of the challenges is letting go of, in some cases, what we think is the right idea, especially if we're looking to effectively communicate with someone from a different culture. And so, again, I don't think there's any right or wrong answer. Oftentimes, we will try and find a middle ground when we're looking at advertising materials. But we also have to consider that every time we find a middle ground, there will be say, a smartphone player, whether it be, say, Samsung or Apple, that are doing everything completely localized. And so we always have to be looking at what is the balance between making sure we are Chinese enough or Western enough if we're coming to China versus, winning the market and competing effectively. And there's never an easy answer, but this is something that I see almost every time when you are looking at trying to work in another market. There have been a few companies that have been very, very localized from the start. I think OnePlus in the early days, at least, I'm not sure about now, but I remember when I talked to the CEO, they were completely just giving the authority to all the local teams in the USA and India to do whatever the heck they wanted. And I've seen some Chinese companies do that in China. I think I've seen some Western companies do that in China. But it's rare, but in many cases, we have to always be striving to communicate more effectively while understanding that we're never going to completely win and be able to do a completely localized approach. And having an understanding, letting go of our ego will also understand we can't completely let go of, say, the organizational ego is something that we always have to deal with. And I don't think there's any easy answer. Lastly, another, I think, agency experience that I thought was very interesting was when a Western retail company was looking to expand further in China. And I believe the agency in question had given them a nice, very detailed report on, Chinese consumer buying habits, how local companies were communicating with Chinese consumers. And I remember one phrase very clearly during the presentation is the boss, who was a Westerner. He was about 50 years old. He spent lots of his career in China. And he said he kind of looked at the presentation about this is how Chinese consumers are buying now. And he said very clearly, he said, that's not how we do things, we being the company. And so, again, this is more of an organizational to client side communications example. And it's something that I think we can all consider is that when we're making if we're in charge of a foreign market, if we're looking at how the company is going to continue to expand, how do we consider local buying habits versus, which might be difficult, versus say what the local big boss in our home country maybe wants to do, or what our organization is used to doing. And again, there's no easy answer, but this is just one more example of what I think is right. In fact, this is every single of these case studies really focuses first on having someone saying, I think this is the right way of doing things in my culture, and then that being applied to a certain degree, if not completely, when moving to another culture, whether it be organizationally, whether it be communicating to stakeholders, or whether it be communicating to consumers. And so I think that's, I think one of the key lessons for today is that letting go of our ego, letting go of what we think is right, at least in part, is one of the key first steps that we can all take in cross-cultural communications. And at the very least, have that thought, have that discussion internally before you take that next step, and it might serve you well moving forwards. That's it for today's topic, I think.
I've got, oh, sorry. Pardon me.
I hope it's been informative to the audience. I certainly enjoyed preparing and giving the presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody has. Jacob, from the audience.
Well, I'm loaded up with questions, Sean, so I'm going to start with an easy one, which is still pretty hard, and then I'm going to move into two more difficult questions that you might find more challenging to answer. So my first question is, Western brands in China, so going into China, what are the struggles that many brands or many teams that enter into the Chinese market generally face? You're a foreigner, you've lived in China, you understand the culture implicitly at this point. It's almost autonomous to you, the way that you engage within those environments. But when new people come into that environment, what are the typical common challenges that a brand would have negotiating with, let's say, an OEM?
Right. Well, it's not simply a cross-cultural issue, of course. I think there's organizational culture does play a role because, and of course, everybody's looking to make money. So I'd say it really comes down to needing to create effective relationships, and as we know, that also relies in part about being here on the ground. And so that's one reason why we've had some of these business relationships for Western companies suffer a little bit during the pandemic, because it was not very easy to either stay in China or come to China on regular business trips. So I think that's one aspect. I think that Western companies are not necessarily used to the hustle and bustle that really happens on the ground. That's a disadvantage they face, is that they aren't used to moving quite so quickly. So again, that's not necessarily a cross-cultural communications issue. But I also think that they don't maybe give enough what would be the right phrase, enough independent decision-making power to whoever they have in China. And so if we're looking at someone wanting to create more better relationships or better partnerships with, say, OEMs in China, I would say they need to make sure they have someone senior enough here or coming over to be talking to these people. And you need to have a lot more conversations up front, because I think there's many Chinese companies that want to work with Western companies, but I do think it can be harder getting on the right wavelength to begin with. And you, of course, there's sincere companies everywhere, but there's also companies everywhere that want to make a quick buck, doesn't matter the country. And so especially in right now, where we have the Chinese economy is not doing very well internally, the Western economy is not doing the best. You definitely need to take, I think, more time to make sure you have the right partner. And that just takes more work on the communication side. I don't think there's any way that you can just really get everything done quickly, especially if you're coming to a new culture and there's new cultural elements, and you may be whoever's doing the communicating, whoever's doing the deal making doesn't necessarily understand the background. You definitely have to take more time to do your homework. That's what I would say.
I mean, generally speaking, from my experience, there is a completely different way of introducing the business deal in China. It takes a lot longer. There's a lot more of what we might typically refer to in a Western market as hand holding, getting used to the culture, getting familiar with one another. And I think from a Western client's point of view, they may think that they're further on in the sales pipeline than they might actually be due into the length of the sales pipeline and how long it takes to establish that communication and trust and build that relationship within China. Okay, so just moving on to my next question, I'm going to flip it round here. What do you think are the biggest challenges that the Chinese side might encounter when either working in Western markets or negotiating with Western businesses?
Um, I really think it's about communicating effectively because, I think we've all seen the ease that many Chinese companies can be in terms of setting up manufacturing, creating effective sales networks. In my 14 years of experience working with Chinese companies, I've never really seen them having that many troubles on that side. Yes, sometimes they have to have a Western sales manager or director, but they know how to do it. The problem I've seen is when they're trying to take that next step to have a good reputation to communicate directly to the consumers. Right now, one of the things that is very common in many Chinese companies that was first, they started by, I think, Anchor or DJI 10, 15 years ago, was the concept of dialog, which is basically just shooting as many ads as you can, whether they're regular ads, whether they're social ads, whether they are just paid KOL partnerships, which can drive traffic to the website, but you aren't actually talking to customers. You aren't letting them know who you are. And I think either I discussed it with you or I discussed it with someone else, a lot of the effectiveness of some type of ad relies on people knowing about the brand. So if you aren't talking to your consumers and building trust with them, then your ads are not going to be that successful, at least in some cases. And so, and I think with the ongoing tensions, there are more people that are potentially more sensitive to companies or products from China. And at the very least, I think we have more Western companies being able to copy some of those Chinese products. And if you can't build your own trust and rapport with consumers, then you'll be replaced by a different company. At least that's my perspective.
Okay, next question. So, one thing that is quite well known, and just for the enlightenment of the audience watching this webinar right now, but the adoption of AI in China is amongst the highest in the world, if not the highest in the world. Ironically, with a lot of chat GPT as an example, but AI platforms are banned in the mainland. It's still the number one adopter. Do you think that there's an over reliance perhaps to fill some of that communication gap between China and the West?
Yeah, I think so. And and it really shows that between the different cultures, there is a different focus. I mean, we talk a lot about automation, improving efficiency in the West. But what I've seen is just easy solutions is what a lot of Chinese AI vendors or so-called AI vendors, sometimes they've admitted they actually don't do anything with AI after they've gotten the first meeting. They just call themselves an AI company. And what I found is that a lot of the AI I've seen in China really focuses on, oh, here's an article for you, or here's a picture, here's a video. And it's not really about understanding and refining the process. It's about, oh, let's just have a quick, easy end result. Again, I haven't talked with more than 5 or 10 companies, I think, or seen that many demos. But from what I have seen is I do think there is a bigger focus on maybe can AI be a quick and easy solution. But if you're actually looking to communicate effectively with your audience, even if you're using AI to streamline your efforts to take away people that you don't need so you can save some costs. In the end, the company has to be responsible for its own communications and ensuring that it actually will strike the right chord. So I think there is a lot of potential for AI, but from what I've seen, a lot of people are looking at AI as a quick and easy fix, which I don't think it can be at this point, especially if we're looking at, end customer communications in a different culture. Like for all I know, the Chinese AI models, they're doing it directly in Chinese. Maybe that works fine for creating things. I haven't looked at that so much, but when you're crossing cultures, I do believe there is a added layer of complexity, which is something we talked about today in the presentation.
Okay, so nice little segue into final question here, but specifically companies like your own, okay, you help a lot of businesses going across that border. So the trend for the next couple of years, let's say 2 to 5 years, what's good, what's bad, how's the market changing, and what are your predictions about the economy, the trade tariffs, the way that trade might be moving across those borders, and how do you think that you're best positioned to help resolve those issues?
Well, one of the trends I think is going to happen is I think that we're going to see a smaller amount of companies take the initiative in terms of trying to communicate more effectively. And maybe they use agencies, maybe they bring on onboard experts, maybe they put other processes in place to make sure they're learning what their customers want, how to communicate with them. I think 50, 60, 70% will try and go the quick and easy way. But I do think that we'll see smaller amount really gain larger success, especially if you're looking at, B2C business. B2B may not see as much of an impact. But China is not going to go away. But I do think that if we're looking at, because so many Western companies are now moving to Southeast Asia, and there may be companies there that can then compete more effectively price-wise against some of the Chinese companies. We do see a lot of prices going up, maybe possibly labor, talent, the price of that going up. And so if Chinese companies want to compete in the long term, they are going to have to be able to build more rapport, more of a brand image, more of a reputation, because if they have no reputation, then it's simply a matter of price, and will always be a new company that's willing to do a low-cost price war in order to get ahead.
Yeah, there is also that trend of a lot of Chinese factories now moving parts of their production to other places such as Cambodia, Vietnam, and various places within Indonesia as well. So, okay, Sean, do you have any final comments? Maybe you can give a recap of like the top three things that you think that people need to be aware of and what they can really learn from your presentation, and then we can
Let's
call it a
see.
day.
So number one, make sure you have a customer-centric approach. Make sure you're focused on not what makes sense to me, but at the very least, even what do you think might make sense to the person you're trying to communicate with. But even if you say, I'm not sure, say you don't understand what the needs are, that at least prevents you from going down the wrong path. And then finally, if you're in an organization, make sure you have some sort of process that clarifies what the standards are for communication, who needs to approve it. For example, let's say if you have English content that's coming out of an AI chat GPT, at the very least, who is actually going to ensure that's an acceptable final product? That kind of thing. If there's no process, then everything could just hit the fan while you're not looking. So solving those issues, it's not about you, understanding what the end customer or communication customer actually wants, and then making sure you have a process to make it happen, not just once, but continuously. Those are the things I would recommend.
Okay, you heard it here first. So, thank you very much, Sean. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here introducing your company, as well as how to resolve challenges when moving across the border, particularly east versus west. And we'll see you in the next one. So, thank you very much for attending, everybody. And thank you for Sean. Sean, I'm sure you'll share these slides later, right?
Yeah.
Okay, lovely. See you
All right.
soon.
Thanks, everyone.